Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master, Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthién. Welcome to Window on the West, where we explore all the ages of Tolkien's Middle-earth, with your hosts, Jonathan Watson, Michael Grumbine, and Dan Coates.
Welcome, everyone, to, I think this is officially episode 30 of us going through the Silmarillion here on Window on the West from theonering.com. This week, we're going to be doing chapter 21 of Túrin Turambar, and we are back. We did a few interviews in the last 3 weeks, which was a lot of fun, kind of a nice change of pace, and I think we're going to be doing more of that. Just so happens, some vacations, I'm actually in South Dakota right now. I'm in a walk-in closet in order to record this, so that's why it might sound
we're going to blame all our problems on the Dakotas.
The South Dakota is great. We got the closest thing to the Argonath here. I don't know if in the world.
Now you're all
United
of a sudden
States
South Dakota. Wow.
We, the Americans, those of us who live in the States, the continental United States, we have our very own just faces Argonath in Mount Rushmore, which was pretty impressive. I liked it a lot. It's pretty large. It's a lot of rock that they had to blast. Anyway, so we are jumping into chapter 21 of Túrin Turambar, and we're on a little bit more of a time crunch here. So we're gonna skip our all that is gold. We're not gonna have a fun little detour here, but we're gonna jump right into the episode. Before we do have an extended podcast, which will be talking more in depth about Turin and probably why this is my favorite story, which Dan and Michael thinks they're a little weird, but we can dive into.
We need to
dive into that a little bit more.
Logical eval, yeah.
So all of you freeloaders, you're going to get to hear Dan and Michael talk about the problems, and then if you want to hear why Jonathan likes this story so much, you'll have to subscribe.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be a lot of fun. So anyway, you can get that by going to theonering.com/patron. It's $4 a month. The first month is free. You get access to our Discord chat. Like I say every week, you get access to our monthly chats, which we just had one here on Saturday, and I did out here in South Dakota, believe it or not. We had a nice chat, and we all went through our 10 questions. Confessions from the comfy chair for all of us who are in that. That was kind of fun. So join us.
Especially our last interview.
Yeah,
he actually knew the rings of the Inferno, which was impressive.
He did. Yeah, our last interview with Austin Freeman was amazing. He was such an in-depth guy, such an accessible way of like talking about Tolkien and the depth that is there. So yeah, listen to that. That was last week's episode. Austin Freeman, and check out his book. Yeah, right there, Tolkien Dogmatics, which we'll probably talk about a little bit at the end of this if you missed it last week. So without any further ado, theonering.com/patron, or hey, you can also go to YouTube and pay an extra $1 because YouTube demands more money from us schlebs. It's $5 a month, and it's not free for the first month, but you can do it through YouTube if it's easier for you. Just click the join button. You get access to Discord and all the other stuff too, extended podcasts. So go ahead and do that. And right now we're going to jump right into
Dan's Big Thought.
All right, so as you all know, I'm reading through the Silmarillion for the first time. This is my first time going through this story, and it struck me immediately that this is a weird story. The story of Turin it's obviously like a tragedy. You know, he's cursed. He's living under the curse of Morgoth, and it's like everything he does, it like has the opposite intended effect. Like he just goes around and like ends up killing his friends, and later on in the story, he does a lot of other horrible things. And so it's interesting to me that Tolkien, I associate Tolkien with like the light is always beyond the reach of evil, good always wins in the end, kind of like that hoping for the good guys to win. And in this story, the good guy is not really a good guy, and the good things that he does usually hurts all the people around him. So it's very strange to me. I don't quite get why Tolkien felt the need to put this in here. One of the things that jumped out to me reading this for the first time was that Turin himself even kind of feels he feels cursed himself, and it's not, even if it's not explained to him in so many words, he just feels that himself, and he also names himself a couple times in this story. And the first one came up in this section that we read for this episode, where he ends up accidentally killing somebody in Doriath, and he runs away and he joins these outlaws. And it says, but Turin abode long among the outlaws and became their captain, and he named himself Nathan the Wronged. So he's just kind of walking around with a chip on his shoulder, like, I am the wronged. This is my whole personality now. Like, this is I identify as the wronged. And I just thought that that's a very psychologically telling thing about this person that we're being introduced to, that he's going around his whole life. I'm the wronged. Everyone always wrongs me. Everyone always is after me. And I just thought that was interesting that Tolkien introduces us to this character in that way.
And he's wronged, like, even his birth, right? His dad is gone, right? Hurin, his dad, right? He's locked up in Angband, or on Angband, I guess, in a chair by Morgoth. And so he starts out with this chip on his shoulder from the from the youth. And there are things that I remember now from the Children of Hurin book that there's far more details about characters in that book, particularly No, I'm not going to say, because I'm going to get it all wrong. But and so I feel like there are things missing in here. But you know, he wasn't exactly a great kid either, if I remember right. Like maybe I'm not remembering that right.
No, there are some hints in his childhood. Yep.
Yeah.
And but for those of you who want a more in-depth treatment, you can wait for 2 years for us to review Children of Hurin.
Michael. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's just the carrot, the long-term carrot. That's all it is.
Yeah. All right.
Before Jonathan moved away to Tennessee, he did give me the gift of the Children of Hurin.
That's right.
And now I'm wondering what that says about them. Yeah.
It's such a good book. It's the only other story that Tolkien wrote that is a full book by itself after he died, right? Meaning it's not like the whole book is the story. You know, it's not like Beren and Luthién, where you get just all the different versions of Beren and Luthién that he wrote over the years with one primary story in the middle. It's the whole thing. So, anyway.
And isn't it telling? I mean, this is the longest tale that we have and the most detailed. So as we go through this chapter, you're going to get all kinds of details of what people did in specific instances, which are very unlike most of the rest of the Silmarillion. Once in a while in the Silmarillion, before this point, you will be told a tale, and they'll say some detail about something. But this is much more in the beat. The sort of narrative flow is much more like you're reading Beowulf, for example. I mean, it is very much, there are a lot of elements of this story which echo Beowulf. And Oedipus Rex and things like, I mean, there's people under, I mean, he is Oedipus in a certain way, as we'll find out by the end, but you know, he's under a curse of the gods, and there are things that happen which are Oedipal. So there's a real shift in Tolkien. I've been, what I was saying before that we started recording, I think is really true, is it almost feels in the Silmarillion like Tolkien is doing a kind of master class, and here's how to write different kinds of literature. Like, he took his hand at myth making a creation story in the beginning of the Silmarillion. Then he shifted, and we had a story of the fall and corruption of a great race, in this case the Noldor, instead of not Min like there would be in the Bible, but in his world, in the Noldor. And then we shifted to in my view, a very Arthurian romance in the story of Beren and Luthién, full of the most magic that you'll ever find in any story of Tolkien, most direct magic, and some outlandish stuff too. I mean, it really is almost out of the pages of an Arthurian tale and legend. And now we've shifted to what is an incredibly dark, very much in my view, a dark Anglo-Saxon tale of a curse and the flaws of a great hero, a great man, a great warrior. And we have just a different kind of story. This reads differently than either the Fall of the Noldor. It reads differently than Beren and Luthién. It reads differently than the Ainulindalë. So I find it fascinating.
And it's interesting. Is there another story that's about really one character in the Silmarillion? I don't think there is. Yeah, it's the
one
only
character.
one
So it just revolves around one person. I mean, there are lots of characters, obviously, in the story, but
but this is Turin's story, whereas everything else is the story of Beren and Luthién. Well, the closest thing is you got is the two of them, but then the fall of Gondolin, right? there's more.
I mean, the story of the creation of the Silmarils and the fall of the. I mean, it's all around Fëanor, but then it shifts to the other Noldor later. But I agree. But ultimately, interestingly, once this story is over, this quote unquote this chapter anyway, which we're going to split into 2 parts. I don't know if we made that clear at the beginning, but
or 3 probably actually,
or 3. Okay,
I think
so. We'll split into multiple parts, but this is, it becomes more than, I mean, we return to Turin again after this story is done. So there's the bloodline of Turin continues on in the story. But you're right, this may be the one that's really focused, and that's why maybe I see it more like a Beowulf story more. But it is very dark, very dark indeed. Yeah,
makes sense. All right, so let's talk about some of the climactic moments in this here. And Dan, you already mentioned how he starts off like he's always got a negative attitude, and you think like his first sister Lilith, which is laughter, she died.
She lasts for a sentence.
She lasts for a sentence, and that's it. Then it's like born in evil. Like when she was 3 years old, there came a pestilence to Hithlum, born on an evil wind out of Angband, and she died.
Yeah. So Morgoth is sending plagues too. Interesting touch. Not just orcs. He sends plagues. But his mother Morwen sends him to live in Doriath, right, with Thingol and Melian, and then she weirdly stays behind. Now the Easterlings are now inhabit the land of Hithlum. They've been given it as a booby prize by Morgoth for their traitorous ways, and so they now occupy the land that the remnants of the men of that place used to, and the men are now enslaved. But Morwen is kind of untouched because there's something terrible and a little. She's beautiful and fey in a way that so the Easterlings are kind of they won't mistreat her as much. But so she sends Turin away to Doriath, and then she won't come. She stays, and so Turin is raised in Doriath.
Right, but right before or right as he's leaving, she gives birth to another child named Nienor, which is now Mourning is the name, Mourning. So we turned laughter into mourning. Which...
and boy, is it mourning, as we will find later on.
Yeah, so we go there and we meet some of the other characters that I really love, like Beleg is in there, and we have Mablung again, and Michael's favorite, Sauron. Not again, but I don't know.
Saeros, but yet.
Saeros, yeah.
So you're thinking, are you mixing them up with Dairon? So there's Dairon and Saeros.
Oh, that might be it. Yeah.
So Dairon is still around, apparently. I can't remember if he died or not, but
he's the same.
Anyway. But Saeros is not long for this world. He doesn't like Turin. So Turin stays there for a while, and then he goes out to fight on the marches, basically make a name for himself. For 3 years he fights, and then he comes back, and he's rather disheveled, and so he gets mocked by this Saeros elf who's jealous of him, and he rewards the elf, the Saeros, his rival, by beating him, stripping him, and making him run naked through the woods and off a cliff. And then he dies. So end of Saeros. And it says, but Turin, deeming himself now an outlaw and fearing to be held captive, refused Mablung's bidding. That's Mablung is telling him, come back to the king and plead your case. And turned swiftly away and passing through the girdle of Melian, he came into the woods west of Sirion. And he joined himself to a band of such houseless and desperate men as could be found in those evil days lurking in the wild. And their hands were turned against all who came in their path, elves and men and orcs. So he immediately, he makes a mistake. I mean, responding to the insult wasn't a mistake, but probably driving the elf off a cliff to his death was a mistake.
Yeah, although he does that, I think we have to say what Saeros said to Turin, which is, if the men of Hithlum are so wild and fell, of what sort are the women of that land? Do they run like deer, clad only in their hair? And so what does he do? He strips him of all his clothes and makes him run like a deer, clad only in his hair. So Turin takes what he says and throws it right back in his face. And I don't think he meant to kill him, but
he goes, they probably look like that.
right. But he does it to an elf, right? And elves, we think of like how they thought of men, right? There are so many elves who think of men as so much less valuable than elves, just like the elves thought of dwarves as so much less, right? They're not worth our time. They're not worth like holding up in any high esteem. And so he probably thinks almost nothing of it. But Turin is like, no, my father was Hurin, son of, right? We've got this line, you owe me because of who I am, really, ultimately, too. And so he does not take well to that. And like you said, drives him off a cliff. But then, and then he runs out. But he's offered a way back. And like you said, Dan, he refuses it. Like he creates his own
self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's what I was thinking of. Thank you.
Yeah, that he is. No. I can't be forgiven by the king. I am Nathan. I am the wronged. I'm just going to be stubborn, and I'm just going to be stuck out here, and I'm making my own home out here in the wilderness rather than going back.
And
to
I remember asking myself when I first read this many years ago, is he right to? Is there something forgivable about that, or is this just pure character flaw? Because the king has forgiven him. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is we see Thingol in this story is a completely different person than he was in the story of Beren and Luthién. He's changed. He's a forgiving king. He takes care of this man. He calls him his foster son. He bends over backwards for him in many ways, through Beleg as well as directly. And so Thingol's now the generous patron and the forgiving and merciful king, and I can't see any actual justification in Turin. All I can see is a character flaw by refusing the pardon of the king and return to Menegroth.
Yeah, I think maybe it's also the one short line. You already read this, Michael, but when Tolkien writes that he joined himself to a band of houseless and desperate men, as could be found in those evil days, and their hands were turned against all who came in their paths, elves and men and orcs. So he has been fighting elves and men and orcs as a band of outlaws, right? He's the outlaws on horses in the Old West, firing discriminately and robbing the trains, and he's
the Jesse James gang. Exactly.
Yeah, right. And so maybe that's why he's like, no, you can't forgive me because you don't even know what I've done in the last year or 2 years, however long it was. Maybe that's part of it.
Okay, so you're going to go with he doesn't believe he can be forgiven then, because he's definitely not forgiving himself, and there's no hint of asking a higher power for forgiveness.
Well, here's what Tolkien says. He says, "But in the pride of his heart, Turin refused the pardon of the king, and the words of Beleg were of no avail to change his mood." So a part of it's pride for sure. Like he's just going to be proud and wrong,
But luckily, in steps the friend he doesn't deserve, who is in my view, the only hero in this entire story, the real hero of the story, who's Beleg's strongbow. So Beleg, nevertheless, doesn't give up on him. So he goes back to the king, and we're introduced for the first time to the idea of an evil sword. Anglachel, the sword made of meteorite iron by Eöl the smith, Eöl the dark elf, and one of two swords made of meteoric iron, and so strong that it can break any other iron. So basically, you're, but as Melian says, there is malice in this sword. The dark heart of the smith still dwells in it. It will not love the hand it serves, neither will it abide with you long. So interestingly, this is Tolkien returning to the real source of what we call magic. He took a brief aside in the Beren and Luthién, where we had magic everywhere. You get magic, and you get magic, and everyone gets magic. He did the Oprah version of magic. So now he's back to what we would regularly call his treatment of magic, which is the heart of the smith dwelling in a thing that he crafts, which gives it the power that it has, be it evil or good, giving it this, whatever abilities it has beyond the natural. In this case, it has quite a few abilities beyond the natural, but most of them don't end well. Although it does do one pretty epic deed by the end. But Anglachel is picked up chosen by Beleg as his weapon, and he goes back and spends more time with Turin, fights more orcs.
I just have to say, how long is Melian going to be around, warning people of things without being listened to ever? Again, right?
1.5 chapters more. Just because you asked.
Thank you. But I'm just like, really, going through this read here, we do it so slowly. I remember all these points. I'm like, Melian, again, like, why are you not? What? She warned you of everything, guys. Like, what? It's the sword. This is not a huge deal. We're not talking about like giving up your whole kingdom or whatever. But remember, just pick a different sword. It's the one that's not as black.
And literally,
and
like, whoever listens to her? I don't think anyone ever listens to her.
Right?
No one takes her advice. She's literally the only Maiar you have. She's on Earth here with you, and she's incredibly wise. And no one listens to her.
It's not like she's a Valar. I mean, you know.
That's right.
You know,
since we're into Middle-earth credentialism, might as well.
Oh man. So anyway, I just had to bring that up. That once again, she doesn't get her due, and her the wisdom of Melian, the wise Melian, which Tolkien I think calls her that, right?
Yes, Melian the Wise. It's in the name, people.
It's in the name, listen. But apparently nobody believes it.
So we do have not only her warning, but a cool part where she gives. I think this is the first time that Lembas appears in Tolkien. I mean, chronologically, the first time that it appears in his work. So she gives Beleg, as sort of a counterbalance to Anglachel, this evil but very powerful sword, this malicious sword. She gives him Lembas, and I quote, "And she gave him store of Lembas, the waybread of the elves, wrapped in leaves of silver, and the threads that bound it were sealed at the knots with the seal of the queen, a wafer of white wax, shaped as a single flower of Telperion. For according to the customs of the Eldalier, the keeping and giving of Lembas belonged to the queen alone." And in nothing did Melian show greater favor to Turin than in this gift, for the Eldar had never before allowed men to use this waybread, and seldom did so again. So we have Melian as precursor to Galadriel here, obviously, echoing the echoes from the past. The queen of the elves, a queen terrible and beautiful and wise, giving Lembas to people who don't deserve it. So there's I thought that was beautiful. Love that.
If you're going to take a stupid sword, at least take a Lembas with you. Maybe that'll help.
Right, exactly.
And so he leaves, right? And I love that we now get to encounter probably my favorite character, just because he's so different, I think, from any other character that we've met yet.
Pay attention, Dan. This is we're going to start seeing the reasons why Jonathan likes this story. His favorite character, and I quote, is Mim the Dwarf. The worst.
The Dwarf. I know, he's just, I'd say, the worst.
The worst.
He's not a great guy.
Okay, Morgoth's the worst.
He's also been wronged. So we learned about Mim the Dwarf, where he came from, and that he was actually, before the dwarves of Nograd and Belcast came over the mountains, the elves of Beleriand knew not what the others were. These dwarves that came from, let's see, for Mim came of dwarves that were banished in ancient days from the great dwarf cities of the east. So these are the dwarves that were banished because I guess maybe they weren't as good as doing dwarven things.
See, that's what I don't think. I don't think so, man. I think they're banished for moral reasons. Like, you don't get banished because you're not as good a smith as.
They became
just a C minus smith. Right. We're going to banish you from our kingdom.
He does say they became diminished in stature and in smithcraft. So maybe they just weren't.
That's a consequence. Sure.
Right. They were
separated.
in detention in high school. They couldn't quite get the shop class right, and so they were just like, guys.
I still hold
the product of their system.
I don't think. I think banishment has more.
Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah.
Then just,
however,
you're not as good of a crafter as the rest of us.
Yeah. I just like that the elves, they knew not what they were, and they hunted them and slew them. And just, there's something not right about these dwarves, so we're just going to slay them whenever we see them, which is essentially what happens to Mim's son. Not Ibun, the other son, which is, I don't remember. Keem.
Keem. Yep.
Keem. And they just see them and they're running, and somebody looses a bow and shoots the dwarf, I'm guessing, in the back as they're running, and he makes it to their cave, and it becomes, as we learn, titled the Cave of Ransom because Hím dies, and Turin comes in and says, I would have recalled that arrow if I could have, but now truly this is the Cave of Ransom. And Mim does, say to Turin that, he offers a bit of respect to him, I guess you could say, even though he's now a prisoner in a way. But I love this whole interaction that you have with a character that you've never met. Maybe it's because it's one of those things. There's a whole story to the petty dwarves that we get, just like we do in these other characters that we get hints of, without it being an entire side quest into who they are. But it's what makes, I think, Lord of the Rings and makes the Silmarillion great, is that there's a whole story that Tolkien had in his own head that he gives us a little hint of that we never really hear from outside of this here, at least that I can remember in any other histories of Middle-earth. And we find that Mim the Dwarf is kind of Turin's downfall in a way then too. So maybe it's a good thing they were banished and they should have shot him more. I guess.
So Mim, it turns out, lives in caves, as Jonathan mentioned, later named the Beren Danwith, the House of Ransom. But it's in this hill called Amon Rûdh, and there's a really cool painting by Ted Naismith, which I will attempt to show, of this. So the hill is crowned with this red Saragon that mantled the stone. So I guess it's a kind of either lichen or flowering plant of some kind. So anyway, there's a cool image from Ted Naismith. Anyhow,
yeah, Amon Rûdh. It's such a unique description of a mountain. I didn't know when I read it until I saw that picture by Ted Naismith. I didn't know what to make of it. Like I couldn't imagine in my head what that actually looks like. This is the description of Amon Rûdh. And as the men of Turin's band drew near, the sun westering broke through the clouds and fell upon the crown, and the Saragon was all in flower. Then one among them said, "There is blood on the hilltop." I was like, wait, what? How does that even look? So yeah, I love Amon Rûdh.
And so Turin actually makes a speech basically saying, he would recall that shaft, the shaft of the arrow that killed Mim's son. And he says, now Beren and Danwith, this house shall be called in truth. If I ever come to any wealth, I will pay you a ransom of gold for your son in token of sorrow, though it gladden your heart no more. And Mim rose and tells him that he speaks like a dwarf lord of old, and he marvels at it and basically says, obviously it doesn't make me happy. Turns out, as we find out, these are the last two petty dwarfs, or they were three. There's no more of them left. With them dies their whole subrace of petty dwarfs, and probably a good thing as it turns out. But they allow Turin and his band to stay there, and they use it as their base of operations. They make it essentially this outlaw outpost that with Beleg, it becomes this much spoken of center of great deeds, where basically people are fighting back against Morgoth in the lands all around. Everyone hears of the deeds of the two captains. Of those two captains are, of course, Turin and Beleg Strongbow.
Right. And Turin is now once again wearing the dragon helm of Dor-Lomin, which goes before him, but also causes a problem for him.
Yeah, slight problem. But he does get himself a new name. Like, this is becoming a straight up Russian novel where everyone has a new name all the time, because so now he names himself, and Turin named himself anew, Gorthol, the Dread Helm, and his heart was Hygen. I should make a list of all the names that Turin has throughout this series, because there are quite a lot.
There are many.
Gorthol. Yeah, but the orcs capture the Mim the dwarf, and they make him essentially reveal to them the caves. The orcs come at night and slay, not without a fight, but they end up coming upon with surprise and slaying all of Turin's band, including, they think, Beleg, and they capture Turin and begin to slowly amble their way back to Angband, celebrating the fact that they have captured Turin and defeated his forces.
But they did not kill Beleg.
Turns out
Beleg is there, and Tolkien writes is when all was silent again, Mim crept out of the shadows of his house, right, as a petty dwarf probably would. And as the sun rose over the mists of Sirion, he stood beside the dead men on the hilltop, but he perceived that not all those that lay there were dead, for by one his gaze returned, and he looked in the eyes of Beleg the elf. I love the the cinematic nature of this chapter.
A lot of eyes.
Yeah, and how but the hatred long stored in Mim stepped up to Beleg and drew forth a sword Anglachel that lay beneath the body of the one that had fallen beside him. Beleg, stumbling up, seized back the sword and thrust it to the dwarf, and Mim in terror fled wailing from the hilltop, and Beleg cried after him, "The vengeance of the house of Hador will find you yet." Foreshadowing and the enemy, the danger between these two races is still so, I don't know. I love that it's like they've been living together essentially for who knows how long at this point, but yet there's still like if you create this in a longer story, and it's there in the Children of Túrin. I've made part of the reason I love it is there's so much going on between all these characters that is under the surface, and that comes out of these great moments like this here.
That's right.
But
so
he was a mighty. Go ahead.
No, that's what we're reading the same part. Go for it.
Oh, but because Beleg was sorely wounded, but as we learn about many of the characters in Tolkien's world that we read about, they are masters or the greatest at something, and so he was a master of healing and did not die, and he slowly his strength returned. He sought in vain among the dead for Turin, but he didn't find him.
Right. He pulled the "I'm not dead yet," so he could live for one page more.
No, geez, yeah, put it so soundly. But we do meet. This is one of the reasons I do like this book too. We meet another character that we came across earlier, which is Gwindor, whose brother, who was a thrall in Angband, but without going into the details, he escaped. And he's the guy who his brother was. His arms were chopped off, his head was chopped off, or his hands, his feet, his legs. Right, they're all chopped off in the beginning of the Near-Nath Arnoriad, and that caused them to run into battle sooner than they should have.
Right, the Near-Nath Arnoriad was, in fact, the beginning of the end of the fall of the elves was this guy's fault. I mean, he was reacting in rage. But Gwindor, in fact, was, and then he was captured and tortured by Morgoth, and he found his way out. And the way Tolkien writes it, it doesn't sound like it was on purpose. It doesn't sound like Morgoth let him go on purpose, like Morgoth does sometimes.
Right, agreed.
It sounds like he was actually like the Noldor elves, being the masters of delving and everything that they were at craft, actually knew these tunnels underneath Angband sometimes better than the orcs, and so sometimes they could actually escape. And looked like Gwindor did actually escape, and lo and behold, runs into Beleg, who re-inspires him with hope, because Beleg is the only true hero of this story. And then they go on to rescue in this midnight rescue, which is pretty cool cinematic moment, because when they find the camp of the orcs, when all in the camp were sleeping, Beleg took his bow and in the darkness shot the wolf sentinels one by one and silently. So you could just see the cinematic thing where he just goes around in a circle. It's like a 2-minute thing where he's just shooting all of. I mean, and you gotta, shots gotta be pretty good to kill him silently with arrows. So he kills them all, and then they enter the camp. Then in great peril they entered in, and they found Turin, fettered hand and foot, tied to a withered tree, and all about him knives that had been cast at him were embedded in the trunk. So you can imagine like the party the orcs were having. They're throwing knives at him while he's tied to
They put an apple on his head, and we're like, we're going to get apple. Right, just keep missing. They're like stormtroopers, so they apparently can't hit him.
I saw this great meme about stormtroopers. Picture of all these stormtrooper ranks and like standing looking at the camera, holding their blasters, and the tagline below says, what was it? Whatever batch of stormtroopers after a fun day of paintballing. they're all
perfectly clean.
So anyway, the stormtroopers of Middle-earth are the orcs apparently, and
but this is why we have Melian's warning. Yeah, they free him, but the blade turns against him. I mean, in a very
first they carry him out in shackles,
and then when they're
out and up a hill, then they use Anglachel because Anglachel can break iron, so they break the iron shackles with Anglachel. But then Anglachel slips and cuts Beleg, and Beleg, who was apparently in a swoon or unconscious.
Cuts Turin, not Beleg.
Oh, sorry, cuts Turin. You're right. So Turin was in a swoon and unconscious. Then he comes conscious, and dun dun dun. Go ahead, Dan, and take it from here.
He kills his own friend.
The only worthy hero in the story.
The only hero in the story who saves his life from being captured by orcs and taken all the way to Morgoth.
Yeah.
And he turns around and kills him immediately.
But not on purpose.
Such a good story.
Sad.
But the cinematic nature again. But as he stood fighting himself free, this is Turin, and ready to sell his life dearly against imagined foes, there came a great flash of lightning above them, and in its light he looked down on Beleg's face. Then Turin stood stone still and silent, staring on that dreadful death, knowing what he had done. And so terrible was his face, lit by the lightning that flickered all about them, that Gwindor cowered down upon the ground and dared not raise his eyes. So many. That's what I mean. There's so much good writing in this story here. That's anyway. So at this point, he falls in the same way that you could say some characters, they just fall into a stupor, like they're psychologically marred, they're wounded, and almost nothing can bring them out of it.
Which would make him a pitiable character to me if he didn't keep coming back and doing stuff over and over again.
Stuff. Diplomatically put. Yeah.
So this is how Tolkien put it. He said, "Thus ended Beleg Strongbow, truest of friends, greatest in skill of all that harbored in the woods of Beleriand in the elder days, at the hand of him whom he most loved. And that grief was graven on the face of Turin and never faded." So he, I think you guys talked about in the last episode, like the superlatives, like Tolkien says, this is the best, this is the worst, this is the, so we learned that Beleg is the truest of friends. And
has the greatest in skill of all that harbored in the woods.
The person he most loved kills him.
Well,
it's very tragic.
It's not worth talking about the guy who's the second greatest in skill of all the harbored.
Right, that's right. That's right.
We want to talk about the actual guys. Let's see. So they walk on, and Gwindor follows him, right? They just kind of like walk together without Turin saying anything.
Yeah, and they're in the middle of a fantastic storm, by the way, which is why the orcs think they're long gone. By the time the storm's over, the orcs leave and go back to Angband empty-handed. It turns out that Turin and Gwindor are still not far away up the slope because Turin won't move at first, but then they slowly wander over the land, like you said, Jonathan, and Turin doesn't say anything for the longest time.
Yeah, it doesn't say how long exactly that is, but it's days, many days, at least for the distance that they're traveling. And what does he do once he finally, once it's broken, and it's broken by the waters of Ulmo, which again, the healing waters in a way, and I think that's important, since in the water, the sound of water again is the echoes of the music of the Ainur, and Turin knelt from that water. It does heal him, yeah. Is that what you're saying?
Of his madness. Yeah, it says specifically, and he was healed of his madness.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Suddenly he cast himself down after drinking the water, and his tears were unloosed at last, and he was healed of his madness. And as Dan likes to point out, what does he do? The very first thing he does is he writes a song. He sings, right?
Is that Dan? I thought it was me. But,
no, it's both.
I'm always pointing out song. Yeah, Dan took up my banner the last two episodes we had. But it is true. Even in this, the saddest and darkest of Tolkien's tales, there's a big song. So there you go.
Yeah, and this is where we learn that where the blade is. Let's see. Gwindor gave the sword Anglachel into his hands, into Turin's hands, and he knew that it was heavy and strong and had great power, but his blade was black and dull and its edges blunt. Gwindor said, "This is a strange blade and unlike any that I've seen in Middle-earth. It mourns for Beleg even as you do." Again, it's an interesting thing. It's like looking at the blade, he's like, huh, the blade's a little sad. Just interesting. But be comforted, for I return to Nargothrond of the house of Finarfin. You shall come with me and be healed and renewed. And they decide to go together back to Nargothrond right after Turin does ask him about Hurin. He's like, "Hey, you were in Angband? Like, did you see my dad?" And he's like, "No, but the rumor of him runs through Angband that he still defies Morgoth, and Morgoth has laid a curse upon him and all his kin." "That I do believe," said Turin, which we do too, for sure.
Yeah, turns out we do. It is interesting. I love that you brought up the fact that the blade is sad, because we will find out the blade will actually speak before the end of this tale. And it turns out that Gwindor was right, or at least according to the blade, he was right.
Yeah.
So anyway.
So we're going to end here, which is the final line. Thus did Turin come to Nargothrond, right? So there's a break right there in the chapter, and we're going to move on. Probably do another third or so next week. Moving into this, it's just a lot to talk about. Any other thoughts that you have on this chapter, other than why in the world I like this more than any other story in the Silmarillion? We're
going to talk about that.
The extended podcast.
Bit. Yep. What else is there to talk about? I love how this chapter reinforces my belief that dwarves are not worth the time. That's awesome.
They're not worth the time? Gimli is not worth the time?
Should have never been made in the first place. If dwarves had never been made and there was no Gimli, there would have been a better elven version of Gimli. So, someone else would have had to step up. So anyway, no, I find the delving into the curse to be fascinating. So Tolkien, remember, ends the last chapter, as it's put together, the last chapter after the Nirnaeth Thornoriad, with the capture and curse and basically Morgoth's fury at Hurin and his people, and Morgoth, and then this chapter begins with Morgoth's own, or not at the very beginning, but it talks about how Morgoth's thought was ever bent towards these people. So basically we have a whole chapter, and we're about to get into the worst part of it, which we haven't even got into essentially Turin's arch nemesis in this chapter, who hasn't made an appearance yet. But there's the whole chapter is about, and the whole story is about, this curse. It's Tolkien exploring the depths of a curse from a Valar onto on a man, and it's really so it's really fascinating that's the topic. Like, of all the great deeds in Middle-earth, we're following the effects of a curse, which of course they lead to tremendous other sorrows and epic events. So I'm not knocking them for that, but it is a very interesting topic to turn to after all this, although perhaps appropriate, because I guess we have some chapters about essentially the consequences of the fall of the Noldor and the corruption from their sin, Fëanor's sin and the sin of his people, and turning away from Valar. And now we have, but this corruption wasn't brought on by the Min themselves. It wasn't. Hurin didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
He didn't. He was just captured and then tortured and then cursed by Morgoth. So very interesting. A rather pessimistic chapter in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I did a quick look up. There's essentially one point in the letters of J.R. Tolkien where he mentions Turin, and this is a letter 131 to Milton Waldman.
131 is one of my favorite letters.
Yeah. Written around 1951, talking about the other stories that he's written, and he writes this: "There are other stories almost equally full in treatment and equally independent, and yet linked to the general history. There is The Children of Hurin, the tragic tale of Túrin Turambar and his sister Níniel, of which Turin is the hero. A figure who might be said, by people who like that sort of thing, though it is not very useful, to be derived from elements in Sigurd the Volsung, Oedipus, and the Finnish Kullervo." And that's the only other mention. So he does mention, right, Oedipus. I'm not as familiar with the particulars of Sigurd or the Kullervo, so I'm sure. I think, but like it's where we need Austin Freeman from last week to come and talk to us about, like, okay, so this is exactly what was in the Kullervo and what was in the.
Yeah, I was trying to look this up because I was reading it, going, "What the heck am I reading?" And I read that there's a chart somewhere. I don't know if it's on Wikipedia or some Tolkien website, but there's a chart that compares Turin to all of those ones you just mentioned, and it's like one of the columns is kills a dragon, has incest, all these different like aspects of the story, kills their friend, brings destruction to their people. And it's like, out of all of those, Kullervo, that Finnish myth you mentioned, they match up exactly, except for the killing of a dragon part. So I thought that was
and that's actually from Beowulf. Like, Beowulf dies killing a dragon. So
that's right. Yeah. Well, Anyway, it's also interesting that it's the first story Tolkien essentially notes as being another complete tale, because a lot of his were incomplete. Which he probably knew selling this one as a story would be a tough sell.
Right. But isn't that interesting that he put so much effort in? Like, I mean, you can see in the narrative details here, there's a lot more effort put in this tale. What an interesting counterpart to the Lord of the Rings it would have been if he had published it as a separate set of works. But I think you're right, Jonathan. He probably knew his audience well enough to know that probably wouldn't get that much play.
Yeah. After the Lord of the Rings, you're like, yep. So we're gonna have a story here about
of despair. First we did hope, and now we're gonna do despair.
Right. Yeah, it's great. I mean, hey, you know, spoiler alert: the dragon is killed in the end, so there's that. But then you have the cast yourself off the edge. The Turin is free. Anyway, so we can go. We'll go into those details probably in 2 weeks when we finish that chapter.
So
all right,
when we finish this, but first we have a lot more names that Turin gives to him. I'm sorry, that Turin gives to himself. We have so many more names. So anyway.
We should try and create a chart of that. All right, so before we jump into the extended podcast for our patrons / subscribers / people who like us more than you do, we're going to jump into
If You Like Tolkien.
Last week, I know a lot of you listen, and you might have skipped the interview we had with John Trent and John Carswell of the Tolkien wrote John Trent from Bounding into Comics. Last week we had Austin Freeman, who wrote a book called Tolkien Dogmatics, which sounds like you might be getting yourself into things that you might not want to like read about in a casual way. But I think so many parts of this book, like it's broken up into so many great segments that so many parts of this book give you so much information. I don't know, Michael, do you have a good way of like kind of giving us other than reading the back of the book?
So my take on this book, and I think I might have even mentioned it in the podcast, is that this is one of the best Tolkien reference books.
Yes.
So Austin Freeman is a closet historian. He's a theologian in historian's clothing, and so the way he puts this together is so well researched, and he references so many of Tolkien's works, basically everything Tolkien ever wrote down and was published of any kind, letters to other books to poems and everything else, that I found. I did a fair bit of testing on him on various quotes where I actually went back to the sources and like, okay, so is his interpretation here, is his reference correct? So did a little fact checking on my own at various spots. Always checked out. The guy does great work. So if you ever want to know what Tolkien thought on a topic of, for example, his angelic hierarchies, Austin Freeman's book will lay that out explicitly. Right. What did Tolkien think about the idea of corruption and the fall? What did Tolkien think about what basically the three great evils that he lays out in Lord of the Rings? Deceit, domination, and idolatry, which are the three, and that Austin very effectively gives evidence for. So basically, everything that has a sort of a theological context, if you want a reference to that in Tolkien's work, Austin's book is the best. It's the best I've seen.
Yeah, and I know what Dan got out of it was that Tolkien is a Calvinist. So. Which actually, though, Austin did write a paper, right? Didn't he say do the presentation on Tolkien and Calvin too, about how some of those there's some alignment there?
So he said it did inspire me to think of like if I had my enough free time, I could do some. I would love to write a counterpoint to that.
Well, now that you mention it, you kind of see a lot of that tension in this chapter of Turin. That there's this curse that's put upon him that's just it determines his whole life before he even does anything, or good or bad. And I think that's interesting. I don't know if that's necessarily Calvinism, but there's something that is put upon him that he has no control of, and his free will in this chapter, he uses it to curse himself and name himself terrible things and be stubborn and proud and resist forgiveness, and it's very interesting.
So would you call him then a vessel of wrath made for destruction? Is that
I don't know.
Nice.
An appropriate reference?
I'm not saying it's 1-to-1, but it's interesting.
Yeah. Go read the book. It's good. We'll put a link down below. Tolkien Dogmatics. You can get it at Lexham Press, LEXHAMPRESS.com, which I think is the best place to get it at, because it has a digital copy too, and you're not giving money to Amazon, but you can get it at Amazon too. All right, so let's jump into the extended podcast. We'll talk a little bit more about this. We'll see what questions we have. I don't know if we had any particulars from our Discord chat, because we're talking about so many other things. But to get that, you can go to thewondering.com/patron. You can, for $4 a month, like I said earlier, become a member. Check it out. If you don't like it, cancel it, and you won't have anything out of your pocket, because you only get charged after the first month. So anyway, all right, guys, let's jump into the extended podcast, and we will cast you aside as we do so.